Everyone in Hollow Creek, Kentucky, thought Maggie Caldwell had finally lost her mind. When the 11-year-old girl began hauling broken concrete, rusted rebar, and wheelbarrows of red clay into the old ravine behind her grandfather's barn, the entire valley had something to say about it. Farmers laughed over coffee at the gravel pit diner. Neighbors shook their heads as they drove past the Caldwell property on Route 42. Some called it a waste of a perfectly good summer. Others said it proved that children raised on too many nature documentaries didn't understand the first thing about real farming. The ravine had been there for 60 years, a jagged scar in the earth left behind by a flash flood in the spring of 1964. It was steep-sided, rock-bottomed, and utterly useless. Nothing grew there except thorn bushes and poison ivy. The soil was too thin, the grade too sharp, and the afternoon sun only hit the bottom for 3 hours a day. Every adult in the county knew that ravine was good for one thing, and one thing only: collecting runoff that nobody wanted. So when Maggie started dragging her grandfather's old surveying stakes down from the barn loft, when she began scratching lines in the dirt with a stick, when she spent 3 consecutive weekends digging a trench wider than her own body, people didn't just think she was being foolish. They thought she was destroying something valuable. Her grandfather, Earl Caldwell, had farmed that land for 47 years. He knew every slope, every drainage pattern, every place where the groundwater rose after a hard rain. He had watched that ravine swallow 3 tractors, a hay wagon, and his own dignity during the flood of '98. He had cursed it, fenced it off, and eventually learned to ignore it. But Maggie couldn't ignore it. She had been watching that ravine since she was 8 years old, sitting on the back porch with her knees pulled up to her chin, counting the minutes it took for the puddles at the bottom to disappear after a storm. While other kids her age were playing video games or swimming in Miller's Pond, Maggie was studying the water stains on the rock walls. She was pressing her palm against the cool clay that only appeared in one specific corner, where the north face stayed shadowed even in July. She was listening to the way the wind changed direction at the ravine's mouth, carrying a damp smell that didn't match the dry dust of the surrounding fields. For 3 years, she had been quietly observing. For 3 years, she had been building a case in her mind that nobody else could see. It started with her grandfather's old farm journals. Earl had kept them religiously from 1978 until his stroke in 2019, recording rainfall, crop yields, livestock health, and the occasional complaint about the weather. After the stroke, he couldn't write anymore, and the journals sat in a wooden crate in the hayloft, gathering dust and swallowing wasps. Maggie found them on a rainy Tuesday in October when she was 9, bored out of her mind because the satellite internet was down again. She didn't read them like a child skimming for interesting words. She read them like a detective. She noticed that in 1983, after the driest summer on record, the only field that didn't turn brown was the one adjacent to the ravine. She noticed that in 1992, when the county drilled 3 new wells, the well closest to the ravine produced twice as much water as the others, even though it was the shallowest. She noticed that her grandfather had written, in his cramped, slanted handwriting, a single line on March 14, 2001. "Ravine's wet at the bottom again. Must be a spring nobody found. Wish I had the money to dig." That line changed everything for Maggie. She began walking the property with a different set of eyes. She found the geological survey maps from 1956 in the county clerk's office, the kind that showed contour lines and bedrock formations that most farmers never bothered to read. She found a topographical map from the Army Corps of Engineers that marked a thin blue line running diagonally beneath the Caldwell property, a line that didn't correspond to any surface creek or named waterway. It was labeled seasonal fracture flow in tiny letters. Maggie didn't know what that meant at first, but she knew what it felt like. She knew that on the hottest day of August, when the rest of the farm was cracking under 98-degree heat, the bottom of the ravine stayed cool. She knew that if she dug her fingers into the clay in that shadowed corner, they came out wet even when the weather report said there hadn't been rain in 17 days. She started keeping her own journal. Not a diary with feelings and doodles, but a scientific log. She measured the depth of the puddles after every storm. She marked the temperature differences between the ravine floor and the surrounding fields. She tracked which plants grew where, and she noticed that the thorn bushes weren't random at all. They only grew in a crescent pattern along the eastern wall, which meant they were following a moisture line. She drew maps in colored pencil. She borrowed books about groundwater hydrology from the county library, books so old that the librarian looked at her twice before checking them out. She learned about perched aquifers, about clay lenses that trapped water above the main water table, about how a fracture in the bedrock could create a vertical channel that fed water upward from deep underground. She learned that sometimes the land held secrets that took decades to reveal themselves, and that the people who found those secrets weren't always the ones with degrees and expensive equipment. Sometimes they were 11-year-old girls who had nothing better to do than pay attention. By the spring she turned 11, Maggie had a theory. She believed that the ravine wasn't a scar at all. She believed it was a natural collection point for a hidden water system that ran beneath the entire valley. She believed that if she could build a reservoir in the deepest part of that ravine, if she could line it with the native clay and shape it with the natural slope, she could create something that would hold water long after the surface creeks dried up. She could create a backup plan for the farm. She could create a safety net that nobody else knew they needed. But she also knew that nobody would listen to an 11-year-old girl with a theory about fracture flows and perched aquifers. So she didn't ask for permission. She didn't present a PowerPoint to the county board. She just started working. The first person to notice was her mother, Clara. Clara worked double shifts at the hospital in Bowling Green and came home so tired that she usually only had energy to microwave dinner and fall asleep on the couch. But one Saturday morning in late April, she looked out the kitchen window and saw her daughter dragging a 50-pound bag of Portland cement down the hill. Clara dropped her coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, but she didn't even look down. She ran out the back door in her slippers, screaming Maggie's name. When she reached the ravine, she saw the trench. She saw the stakes. She saw the pile of broken concrete that Maggie had salvaged from the old Miller place after it was torn down. Clara's face went white. She grabbed Maggie by the shoulders and asked, in a voice that was equal parts terror and exhaustion, what in God's name she thought she was doing. Maggie looked at her mother with the calmest expression Clara had ever seen on a child and said, I'm building a reservoir. The ravine has a spring in it. If I don't catch the water now, we'll lose it when the drought comes. Clara didn't know what to do with that. She called her father Earl, who was sitting in his wheelchair on the porch, watching the whole scene with a peculiar expression. Earl didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the ravine, then at his granddaughter, then back at the ravine. Finally, he said, let her work. Clara argued. She said it was dangerous. She said Maggie could get hurt. She said the county would have a field day if they found out a child was doing construction work on a slope. Earl just repeated himself, quieter this time. Let her work. That girl's been watching that ravine longer than any of us have been watching our own fields. Clara threw her hands up and went back inside, but she didn't stop Maggie. That was the first small victory. It was also the first crack in the wall of opposition that would soon grow much louder. Word spread quickly in a town like Hollow Creek. By the second week, the neighbors started driving by slowly, their pickup trucks crawling along the gravel road so they could stare at the little girl in overalls, knee-deep in red clay, shoveling dirt into a wheelbarrow that was almost as tall as she was. The Henderson brothers, who farmed the property to the east, laughed so hard that one of them dropped his chewing tobacco. They told everyone at the feed store that Earl Caldwell had lost his grip on reality, letting his granddaughter dig herself into a grave on his property. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the valley for 80 years and considered herself an authority on everything, walked over one afternoon with a cane and a sour expression. She stood at the edge of the ravine and told Maggie that she was disturbing the natural drainage. She said that ravine was there for a reason, that God had put it there to carry water away, not to store it. She said that if Maggie kept digging, she would undermine the whole hillside and send a mudslide into the Hendersons' south pasture. Maggie listened politely, thanked Mrs. Patterson for her concern, and went back to digging. Mrs. Patterson left in a huff, muttering about the disrespect of children today. The third week brought the first real warning. A man from the county soil conservation office drove out in a white truck with a government seal on the door. He introduced himself as Mr. Davenport, and he had a clipboard and a frown that looked like it had been permanently attached to his face. He explained that someone had filed a complaint about unauthorized earth moving on a graded slope. He said that altering the drainage pattern of a ravine could have serious consequences for downstream properties. He said that Maggie needed to stop immediately and that her grandfather would need to apply for a permit if he wanted to continue any kind of construction. Maggie stood there with her hands on her hips, covered in mud, and asked Mr. Davenport if he knew what a perched aquifer was. He blinked. He said he didn't see how that was relevant. Maggie said it was relevant because the ravine had a natural clay layer at 16 feet that created a confining bed, and if she could seal the reservoir properly, she wouldn't be altering the drainage at all. She would be enhancing it. Mr. Davenport wrote something on his clipboard, told her to stop until the county could review the situation, and drove away. He never came back. The county had bigger problems than an 11-year-old girl with a shovel and a theory, but the opposition didn't stop. It escalated. The Henderson brothers started calling Earl directly, telling him that his granddaughter's little mudhole was going to ruin their property values. They said that if Earl didn't put a stop to it, they would take legal action. They said that a child had no business playing engineer on a working farm, and that it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. Clara started getting phone calls at the hospital. Some of them were concerned. Some of them were angry. One anonymous caller told her that she was a negligent mother and that Child Protective Services should be notified. Clara cried in her car during her lunch break. She drove home that night and begged Maggie to stop. She said the stress was too much. She said people were talking. She said that Maggie was too young to understand the consequences of what she was doing. Maggie looked at her mother with those same calm eyes and said, "Mom, I understand the consequences of not doing it. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone." The cost of Maggie's work was growing, and not just in terms of social pressure. She was spending every waking hour in that ravine. Her hands were blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. She had scraped her shin so badly on a piece of rebar that she needed 6 stitches, and the doctor at the urgent care clinic looked at her grandfather with such disapproval that Earl had to leave the room. She was falling behind in her schoolwork because she was too tired to focus after hours of physical labor. Her friends had stopped asking her to come over because they knew she would say no. She was eating alone at lunch because the other kids thought she was weird, obsessed with dirt and water in a way that didn't make sense to them. She was paying a price that no 11-year-old should have to pay, and she was paying it quietly without complaint because she could see something that nobody else could see. Then came the first discovery. It happened on a Thursday in late May, when Maggie had dug down almost 5 feet into the eastern wall of the ravine. She had been working on shaping the basin, trying to create a bowl that would hold water without leaking. She hit something hard, not rock, not clay, something that sounded hollow when she tapped it with her shovel. She cleared the dirt away with her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found a layer of compacted gravel that shouldn't have been there. It was clean, rounded gravel, the kind that formed in stream beds. But it was 6 feet below the surface in a ravine that hadn't held a running stream in 60 years. Maggie knew immediately what it meant. Water had been flowing through this channel for a long time, long enough to deposit gravel and then bury it under sediment. The ravine wasn't just a drainage ditch. It had been a waterway once, and the gravel was proof that the underground flow was stronger than anyone had measured. She ran to the house, her legs shaking, and showed her grandfather. Earl wheeled himself down to the ravine, something he hadn't done in months because the slope was too steep for his chair. Maggie helped him. She held his arm and steadied his chair as they navigated the rocks together. When they reached the gravel layer, Earl put his hand on it and closed his eyes. He didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he opened his eyes and looked at his granddaughter, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there in years. Not pride, exactly. Something deeper, recognition. He said, "You found the old channel. I always wondered if it was still down there." Maggie asked him what he meant. Earl explained that his own father had told him about a spring that used to run through the ravine before the 1964 flood changed the landscape. The spring had been buried, but it had never completely died. It had just gone underground, waiting for someone patient enough to find it again. The second discovery came 2 weeks later. Maggie had been studying the way water moved through the gravel layer, pouring buckets of water into her test trench and timing how long it took to drain. She noticed that the water didn't drain evenly. It drained faster on the north side, where the clay was thinner, and slower on the south side, where the clay was thick and gray and slick between her fingers. She started digging test holes along the south wall, small pits no wider than a dinner plate, going deeper and deeper until she found what she was looking for. At 11 feet, the clay turned into a dense plastic material that held its shape when she squeezed it. At 13 feet, she found water seeping into the hole from the bottom, not from the sides. The water was cold, shockingly cold, and it had a faint mineral taste that reminded her of the well water at her grandmother's house in Tennessee. She had found the fracture flow. She had found the vertical channel that carried water up from the deep bedrock, feeding into the perched aquifer above. It wasn't seasonal. It was constant. It was a reliable source that had been there all along, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Maggie didn't tell anyone about the second discovery. Not her mother, not the neighbors, not the county. She kept it to herself, the way a poker player keeps a winning hand close to her chest. She knew that if she revealed what she had found, the opposition would only get worse. People would say she was making it up. They would say she was a child who didn't understand what she was talking about. They would find a way to take it away from her, to claim it for themselves, to turn her discovery into something dangerous and regulated and controlled. So she kept digging, she kept building, she kept laying the broken concrete along the walls to create a retaining structure, packing the gaps with clay she had harvested from the south wall, shaping the basin with a precision that would have impressed a professional engineer. She was creating a reservoir that would capture not just the rainwater, but the spring water that rose from the deep fracture. She was creating a system that would store water when everyone else was losing it. The third discovery was the one that changed everything. It happened in the middle of June, when the heat had climbed into the high 90s and the first whispers of drought started circulating through the county. The corn was still green, but it was starting to curl at the edges. The creek that ran through Miller's property was lower than anyone had seen it in July, let alone June. The old-timers at the diner were shaking their heads and talking about the drought of 2012, the one that had cost the county millions in crop losses. Maggie was working in the ravine every day now, sometimes starting at dawn and not finishing until the mosquitoes drove her inside at dusk. She had almost completed the basic structure. The reservoir was roughly 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 8 feet deep at the lowest point. The clay lining was packed and smooth. The concrete retaining walls were holding. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon so hot that the air shimmered above the fields, she noticed something impossible. The reservoir was filling, not from rain. There hadn't been a storm in 11 days, not from runoff. The surrounding ground was baked hard as brick. The water was rising from the bottom, seeping up through the clay in a way that shouldn't have been possible unless the pressure from below was increasing. Maggie stood at the edge of her creation, watching the water level climb half an inch in the space of an hour, and she understood. The fracture flow wasn't just a trickle, it was a pulse. It responded to pressure changes deep underground, and the drought that was drying out the surface was actually forcing more water upward through the deep channels. The reservoir wasn't just catching water. It was tapping into a deep aquifer that was being squeezed by the same drought that was killing everything else. She had built her reservoir at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, to capture a resource that was about to become the most valuable thing in the county. She told her grandfather that night. Earl listened to her explanation, her voice shaking with excitement and exhaustion, and when she was done, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm and strong despite the stroke. He said, "You didn't just build a pond, Maggie, you built a lifeline. And I think you're about to find out just how much this valley needs it." She didn't fully understand what he meant until the drought arrived in earnest. It started with the Henderson brothers' well. Their property was the closest to the Caldwell farm, and their well was the shallowest in the valley, drilled in the 1980s when water was plentiful and nobody thought about the future. One morning in mid-July, Tom Henderson turned on his kitchen faucet and nothing came out. He checked the pump. He checked the breaker. He checked the pressure tank. Everything was working, but the water was gone. The well had run dry. Tom called a well company from Bowling Green, and they drilled another 20 feet, then another 30, then another 50. They hit nothing but dry rock and dust. The Hendersons had to start hauling water in plastic tanks from town, 140 gallons at a time, just to keep their livestock alive. Their corn was already a lost cause. The leaves had turned the color of parchment, and the stalks snapped like dry twigs when you touched them. Then Mrs. Patterson's well failed. Then the Miller place. Then the old Johnson farm on the ridge. One by one, the wells that had sustained the valley for generations began to cough up mud, then air, then nothing at all. The creek that ran through the center of the county dried up completely, leaving behind a bed of cracked clay that looked like a puzzle assembled by a madman. The county declared a water emergency. The governor issued a statement. FEMA started taking phone calls. People stood in line at the distribution center in Bowling Green, waiting for bottled water that ran out before half the line was served. The drought wasn't just a dry spell anymore. It was a catastrophe, and through it all, Maggie's reservoir kept filling. The water level rose steadily, fed by the deep fracture that nobody else had known existed. It didn't just hold water, it overflowed. Maggie had built a small spillway at the northern end, a channel lined with rocks that directed excess water down a gentle slope toward the Hendersons' south pasture. She hadn't planned it that way exactly. She had been thinking about erosion control, about making sure the reservoir didn't undermine the hillside. But the spillway became something else entirely. It became a creek, a small, steady, reliable creek that ran day and night, carrying water from the deep earth to the surface world. Tom Henderson was the first to notice. He was driving his truck along the property line, cursing the dust and the heat and the $1,000 he had spent on water hauling that week, when he saw something that made him slam on the brakes. There was water running through the south pasture, not a flood, not a storm surge, a steady, gentle flow of clear water that was cutting a new channel through the dry grass. He followed it upstream with his eyes, and his gaze landed on the Caldwell property, on the ravine, on the reservoir that he had mocked for 3 months. He got out of his truck and walked to the fence line, and he stood there for a long time, watching water flow through land that had been dead for weeks. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The realization was too big, too humiliating, too overwhelming. The little girl he had laughed at, the mud hole he had called a waste of time. It was the only source of running water in the entire valley. Tom told his brother. His brother told Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson told everyone at the diner. By the next morning, there was a line of pickup trucks parked along Route 42, and people were standing at the fence with their hats in their hands, staring at the impossible sight of water flowing from a ravine that had been dry for 60 years. Some of them were crying. Some of them were praying. Some of them were just standing in silence, trying to understand how an 11-year-old girl had found something that every adult in the county had missed. Earl wheeled himself down to the fence line, and he looked at the crowd, and he looked at his granddaughter, and he smiled a smile that was part sadness and part triumph. He said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "She told you there was a spring. None of you believed her. Now she's keeping your animals alive, and you're standing here like you just saw the second coming." The social reversal was swift and total. The Henderson brothers came to the house that evening, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables and a check for $500. They didn't apologize directly. Men like them didn't know how to apologize, but they offered to help Maggie expand the spillway. They offered to bring their equipment to dig a proper distribution channel. They offered to pay for any materials she needed. Mrs. Patterson sent a pie, a peach pie, made with the last of her canned peaches, and a note that said, "I was wrong. You were right. God bless you, child." The county soil conservation office called and asked if Maggie would be willing to give a presentation at the next board meeting. Mr. Davenport himself came out to the farm with a new clipboard and a different expression on his face, one that looked suspiciously like respect. He asked Maggie to explain the fracture flow system to him, and he took notes, real notes, the kind that engineers take when they're learning something new. But the most important change happened inside the community. The reservoir became more than a water source. It became a symbol. People started calling it Maggie's Lake, even though it was technically a reservoir. They started bringing their children to see it, to show them what one person could do if they paid attention to the land. They started asking Maggie questions, not as a child to be humored, but as an expert to be consulted. She told them about the perched aquifer. She told them about the clay lens. She told them about the fracture flow that responded to pressure changes deep underground. She explained that the drought had squeezed the deep aquifer like a sponge, forcing water upward through channels that had been dormant for decades. She explained that the reservoir had been built at the exact intersection of three geological features: the old stream channel, the clay confining bed, and the vertical fracture. She explained that it wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was observation. It was patience. It was the willingness to look at something that everyone else had dismissed and see the potential that was hiding beneath the surface. The reservoir saved the valley. That wasn't an exaggeration. It was a fact. The water that flowed from Maggie's spillway kept the Hendersons' remaining livestock alive. It irrigated Mrs. Patterson's vegetable garden, which became the only source of fresh produce for 3 miles. It filled the fire department's tanker trucks when a brush fire broke out in the national forest, a fire that would have consumed 300 acres if they hadn't had water to fight it. It gave the county time to drill a new municipal well, deeper than the old ones, tapping into the same deep aquifer that Maggie had found. By the time the drought finally broke in October, the reservoir had become a permanent feature of the landscape, a living monument to the power of paying attention. But the story didn't end when the rain returned. The story changed, the way stories do when they become part of a place's identity. Maggie kept working. She kept studying. She expanded the reservoir with help from the community, adding a proper clay core, building a stone overflow channel, planting willows along the banks to prevent erosion. She learned that the willows did more than stabilize the soil. Their roots reached deep into the fracture zone, creating a biological pump that drew even more water to the surface. She learned that the reservoir had created a microclimate, a pocket of cool, moist air that attracted birds and insects and small mammals that hadn't been seen in the valley for years. She learned that the land didn't just give up its secrets to those who dug the deepest. It gave them up to those who watched the longest, who listened the hardest, who trusted the quiet signals that everyone else ignored. Her grandfather died the following spring, peacefully, in his sleep, with Maggie's hand in his. He left her the farm journals, all 42 of them, and a note that said, "You see what I saw, but you did what I never had the courage to do." Maggie kept the journals in a glass cabinet in the farmhouse, and she added her own journals to the collection, the ones she had started when she was 9 years old, the ones with the colored pencil maps and the puddle measurements and the temperature readings. She kept them as a reminder that knowledge wasn't something you acquired in a classroom. It was something you earned in the field, with dirt under your nails and sweat on your face, and the patience to wait for the land to tell you its secrets. The reservoir is still there. If you drive down Route 42 in Hollow Creek, Kentucky, you can see it from the road. A blue-green pool nestled in the curve of the old ravine, surrounded by willows that have grown tall enough to shade the water. There's a small sign at the entrance to the Caldwell property that says Maggie's Lake, put there by the County Historical Society. The water is clear and cold, and if you kneel at the edge and press your hand into the clay, you can feel the faint vibration of the deep fracture flow, the heartbeat of an underground river that has been running for 10,000 years. People come from other counties to see it. They bring their children, and they tell them the story of the 11-year-old girl who was ridiculed for digging in the dirt, who was mocked for believing in something she couldn't see, who was warned by experts and laughed at by neighbors and pressured by her own family to stop. They tell them how she kept working, how she kept believing, how she trusted the land when nobody else did. And they tell them the most important part of the story, the part that makes it worth remembering. They tell them that when the wells ran dry, when the crops withered, when the creek beds turned to dust and the animals started dying, The only place that still had water was the place that everyone had called useless. The only person who had prepared for the future was the one everyone had dismissed as a foolish child. The lesson of Maggie's Lake isn't complicated. It doesn't require a degree in hydrology or a background in engineering. It requires something much simpler and much harder. It requires the willingness to look at a ravine and see a reservoir. It requires the patience to study something for 3 years before you touch it. It requires the courage to keep digging when everyone around you is telling you to stop. It requires the humility to admit that the land knows more than we do, that it has been here longer than we have, and that it is still teaching us things we haven't learned to hear. The land speaks in patterns, in temperature changes, in the way water moves through rock and clay and time. It speaks to those who are quiet enough to listen, patient enough to watch, and brave enough to believe that what they see is real. Even when nobody else can see it yet. Maggie Caldwell is 17 now. She still lives on the farm, and she still walks the ravine every morning, checking the water level, measuring the flow, watching the willows grow. She is studying environmental science at Western Kentucky University, taking classes at night and working the land during the day. She has been offered internships with the Army Corps of Engineers, with the State Department of Water Resources, with private consulting firms that pay more in a month than her grandfather made in a year. She has turned them all down. She says she still has things to learn from the ravine. She says the reservoir isn't finished teaching her. She says that the fracture flow changes every season, that the deep aquifer responds to pressures that scientists are only beginning to understand, and that she wants to be there when the land reveals its next secret. People think she's crazy for staying. They say she's wasting her potential, her talent, her youth on a patch of dirt in a valley that most people have never heard of. But Maggie just smiles and goes back to her journals, her maps, her measurements. She knows that the people who call her crazy are the same people who called her crazy when she was 11. She knows that the land doesn't care about degrees or salaries or reputations. She knows that the next drought is coming, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but someday. And when it comes, she wants to be ready. Not because she wants to be a hero, not because she wants to be admired, but because she made a promise to the ravine a long time ago, when she was just a child with a shovel and a theory. She promised that she would listen. She promised that she would pay attention. She promised that she would trust the land, even when nobody else did. And some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long they take, no matter how much they cost, no matter how many people tell you that you're wasting your time. Because the truth is, the only thing more valuable than water is wisdom. And the only way to find wisdom is to dig for it, one shovel at a time, one observation at a time, one quiet morning at a time, until the land finally decides to show you what it has been hiding all along. The reservoir holds steady at 8 feet now, even in the driest months. The spillway runs clear and cold, feeding a creek that has become permanent, that has carved a new channel through the valley, that has brought back the frogs and the herons and the watercress that nobody had seen in a generation. The county has named it an official water source, protected by law, maintained by the community. There are benches along the northern bank, placed there by the Henderson brothers, who come to sit sometimes in the evenings watching the water move. They don't talk much. They don't need to. They just sit there. 2 old farmers who once laughed at a little girl, and they listen to the sound of water flowing through a place that they had written off as dead. It is a sound that humbles them. It is a sound that reminds them. It is a sound that says, very quietly, that the people who are dismissed are often the ones who are preparing for a future that nobody else can see, And if you are lucky enough to be around when that future arrives, the only thing you can do is be grateful. Grateful and quiet, and wise enough to know that the next time someone starts digging in a ravine, you should probably ask what they know before you tell them to stop.